One broken tank in the sand helped decide how a 60 million death war would end. World War II didn't just chew through soldiers, it chewed through machines. More than 200,000 tanks and armored vehicles ground into scrap across Europe, Africa, and Asia. While cities burned and borders moved, another battle raged far from the front lines, a quiet war between factories, blueprints, and production lines. Who really wins a modern war, the side with the most powerful machine, or the side that can never run out of them? To find the answer, we go back to one silent witness. August 1942, North Africa, near El Alamein. The desert wind kept dragging dust across a strange silhouette, half buried in the sand. Its turret blown open, its hull scorched, but still recognizable. An American M4 Sherman knocked out, abandoned, already fading into the landscape. Around it, figures moved, German officers and engineers from the Afrika Korps, uniforms bleached by sun, boots sinking into the dune. They circled the wreck like men, inspecting a captured animal. One officer rapped his knuckles on the armor. "Too tall, too thin, too simple," he muttered. "This is what the Americans send?" Laughter rolled across the sand, fed by belief in their own legend. These were men who trusted machines like the Panzer IV and the soon-to-arrive Tiger, steel beasts built with meticulous care, hauling blades of precision through every engagement. Compared to those, this foreign tank looked almost clumsy, an ungainly box on tracks, civilian in its proportions. But history has a habit of hiding its verdict in plain sight. Lieutenant Klaus Mittner, a young engineer, didn't laugh. He watched the others, then stepped closer. The sun hammered down on the Sherman's olive-drab paint, now blistered and peeling. He brushed sand away from one stamped marking, then another. Numbers, codes, standardized symbols he recognized from industrial catalogues, not bespoke armories. This was not how German tanks were born. He pulled at the hatch. It groaned open, spilling sand like powdered bone across the hull floor. Mittner climbed up, leaned inside. What he saw didn't look like a masterpiece. It looked like a product. Controls laid out cleanly. Gauges clear, almost obvious. Levers sized and placed for hands that might never have seen a tank before. Wiring loomed and labeled. Components numbered. No need for a craftsman to feel the fit. Just follow the markings, tighten the bolts, move on. He frowned and jotted in his notebook. Layout suggests automotive origine. Mass production design. Behind that simple line hid a terrifying implication. Because while Germany had spent years perfecting armored jewelry, hand-fitted gearboxes, complex suspensions, thick armor plates, machined to tight tolerances, the United States was turning car factories into tank lines. Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, names once stamped on sedans, now stamped on armor. By war's end, America would build nearly 50,000 Shermans. Germany would never even come close to that number, with its heaviest tanks combined. But in 1942, none of that was obvious. Not yet. On that day in the desert, all the Germans saw was a weak tank that had lost. They didn't see the real battlefield forming thousands of miles away, assembly lines that never slept, workers in shifts, parts rolling off in endless streams, every bolt interchangeable with every other. Was power still about the single strongest machine? Or was the future of war moving somewhere else into the realm of systems, logistics, and speed of replacement? That question starts here, beside a wrecked Sherman in the North African sand. In the next chapter, we follow this same machine to a place far from the desert, a German proving ground, a hangar filled with oil, smoke, and disbelief, where the people who laughed at the Sherman will be forced to take it apart, piece by piece, and confront the truth hiding inside. Some wars are lost, not on the battlefield, but on the workbench where a bolt fits perfectly into a thread designed an ocean away. Winter 1943 dragged its cold breath across Kummersdorf, Germany's secret proving ground. The war had already swallowed more than 25 million lives, turned entire cities into blackened grids on a map, and pushed Europe to the edge of exhaustion. Yet inside a vast hangar smelling of oil, iron, and frayed nerves, another kind of battle unfolded, quiet, clinical, and far more prophetic than the men working there realized. Under the floodlights stood a captured M4A1 Sherman, hauled from North Africa and frozen in a half-scorched coat of olive drab. Its dents and burn marks told one story, a battlefield loss. But the story waiting inside its hull was louder than any shell fired in the desert. Klaus Mittner, the same German engineer who weeks earlier had brushed sand off a wrecked Sherman at El Alamein, now approached this intact specimen with a strange mix of curiosity and dread. Around him, the other engineers spoke with the same dismissive tone he'd heard in the desert, too tall, too crude, too simple. But Mittner had learned that war punished assumptions, and this machine, this unremarkable silhouette of steel, felt like something built for a purpose larger than its shape. He ran a gloved hand across the stamped numbers, uniform, sharp, manufactured with a consistency that felt alien, in a country where tanks were still assembled like custom instruments. "Begin disassembly," the senior engineer ordered. Tools scraped, sparks hissed, panels thudded onto the concrete floor. The first true shock arrived when they lifted the rear deck. There, nestled inside the hull, sat the Continental R975, a radial aircraft engine repurposed for armor. To German thinking, it was heresy. Tanks were supposed to run on liquid-cooled Maybachs, engineered with the precision of a watchmaker. This thing looked like it belonged in a crop duster. "It will never start cleanly," one technician scoffed. Mittner nodded for the fuel line. The starter whined, coughed once, then the engine erupted with the steady, confident rumble of a creature that understood harsh environments better than the men judging it. No coolant to leak, no delicate piping to rupture, no hand-tuned adjustments, just ignition instant, obedient, alive. "It starts easier than a Panzer III, the assistant shouted above the vibration. Mittner didn't respond. He was staring at the engine mount, frozen by the sight of numbered brackets, pre-cut wiring, bolts machined so consistently he could have swapped them blindfolded. The realization tightened like a vice around his ribs. This engine wasn't engineered to be admired, it was engineered to be replaced. And in a war where North African heat could hit 120 degrees, that simplicity wasn't primitive. It was survival. Then came the moment that cracked open the entire room. The transmission, once split apart, revealed a cast number identical to the transmission of a Sherman captured months earlier in Italy. The same threads, same tolerances, same shape, same everything. The hangar fell silent. "Interchangeable," Mittner whispered. The words struck like a verdict. German tanks had to be fitted by hand. Craftsmen hammered gears, shaved plates, coaxed alignment through skill and intuition. Panthers and Tigers drained hundreds of labor hours, even after assembly. But this foreign machine? Every part knew exactly where it belonged, no persuasion required. If America lost 100 tanks, they could rebuild dozens in a week. Germany, losing half its armor in some sectors, could barely keep pace with its own maintenance. Hours later, when they opened the radio compartment, another blow landed. Inside sat a standardized SCR-508 long-range transmitter, one in every Sherman. In the German army, radios were rare, reserved for command tanks. Many crews still waved flags or shouted across mud-filled fields. "They must have tens of thousands of these," someone murmured. "Tens of thousands," Mittner corrected. The Sherman wasn't a vehicle, it was a node in a communication network. By midnight, they moved to the suspension. Simple vertical volute springs. No torsion bars, no layered wheels, no elegant engineering. It looked outdated, even childish. Until they timed a replacement. Under an hour, a Panther required most of a day. Piece by piece, the truth rose from the concrete floor like a ghost. The Sherman's armor might have been thinner, its profile higher, its gun less intimidating, But its genius lay in its humility, in the way it invited repair rather than worship. By dawn, the hangar floor was covered with neatly labeled components, each one a reminder that this tank was never meant to be immortal. It was meant to be multiplied. Mittner wrote his report in tight strokes. Frontal armor consistent, engine reliable, interior simplified for rapid training, production clearly derived from large-scale automotive methods. Then he hesitated before adding the sentence that split the war in two. We can build one Sherman, but we cannot build 10,000. Outside, the winter wind dragged snow across the proving grounds like a warning. Inside, the German engineers stared at the truth laid bare in steel. They weren't fighting machines, they were fighting a system. And as the months marched toward 1944, that system would take shape on the fields of Normandy, where a single duel meant nothing against a wave of vehicles built faster than they could be destroyed. War has a way of dragging truth out of shadows, and by the summer of 1944, the truth uncovered in that cold German hangar finally burst into daylight on the fields of Normandy. Europe was bleeding. More than 40,000 civilians had died in the first weeks of the Normandy campaign alone. Entire villages flattened under the weight of artillery, and armor losses on both sides climbed past 2,000 vehicles before July even ended. This was no longer a war of legends, it had become a war of exhaustion, where steel wore out faster than courage, and into that crucible rolled the Sherman. Not elegant, not feared, but present, always present. The Tiger crews had waited for this moment, fed by belief that their machines were unmatched. Their 88mm cannons were precise, their armor thick enough to shrug off hits that would crack other tanks open like eggshells. They were the masters of the duel, but Normandy was not a dueling ground. It was a maze of hedgerows, dense barn-sized walls of earth and roots, thousands of miles of natural fortification that swallowed sound and swallowed sight. At dawn near Villers-Bocage, a Tiger commander raised his binoculars above the brush. What he saw made his breath tighten. A line of Sherman tanks advancing across the fields, engines humming in disciplined rhythm. Not 5, not 10. Dozens, stretching into a horizon still smudged with smoke from the landings. Range them, the commander ordered. The Tiger fired. One Sherman erupted in a plume of flame. Reload, fire. Another Sherman buckled sideways, thrown against a stone fence. Reload, a third, a fourth. Each hit dragged the air into silence. But the silence never lasted. Because every time the Tiger carved a hole in the American line, more Shermans slipped through, hauling their blades of momentum toward the German positions. The commander lowered his binoculars and muttered what many would echo in the months ahead. They never stopped coming. The Germans were discovering a new arithmetic of war. One Tiger, in ideal conditions, could knock out 5, even 10 Shermans. But while a Tiger required 300,000 labor hours to build, a Sherman consumed less than 50,000. While Germany produced tanks in the hundreds each month, the United States, humming with factories from Michigan to California, was producing 2,000 Shermans every 30 days. In the time Germany built one Tiger, America built an entire armored battalion. And that mattered because the hedgerows didn't care about prestige. A Tiger immobilized by a broken track could block an entire road for hours. A Sherman immobilized by the same damage could have its suspension swapped on the roadside in under 60 minutes. American mechanics didn't pray for replacements, they uncrated them. Engines arrived pre-crated, transmissions bolted onto pallets, radios packed by the thousands. Units in Normandy recovered and rebuilt damaged Shermans at a rate Germany couldn't imagine. One maintenance officer later recalled, "We rebuilt a tank from 3 wrecks before sunset. It wasn't heroism, it was process." The German crews felt that process like a tightening noose. Reports from the 2nd SS Panzer Division recorded scenes where Tigers fought brilliantly, destroyed dozens of enemy vehicles, and still found themselves retreating days later, not because they were defeated tactically, but because fresh American armor had flooded the same ground they had bled to hold. Otto Carius, one of Germany's most respected tank commanders, wrote with brutal honesty, "For every Sherman we destroyed, 3 more appeared." He wasn't exaggerating. By July, U.S. factories had shipped more than 1,500 replacement vehicles directly to Normandy. The numbers weren't statistics, they were waves. Back in Berlin, the Armaments Ministry tried to map the losses. They saw German armored divisions losing 40 to 60% of their strength in some battles. They saw American divisions report losses too, but then miraculously return to full strength in a matter of days. A colonel reviewing the numbers wrote, "We are fighting a warehouse, not an army." Yet the deeper collapse wasn't mechanical, it was psychological. Tiger crews, once proud, now found themselves staring across open fields filled with Shermans that refused to stay gone. Every duel won felt smaller, drowned by the sound of more engines approaching. A veteran Panther driver confessed, "You can destroy machines, but you cannot destroy a factory." Normandy became the living proof of what Mittner had warned inside that cold hangar. The Sherman was not designed to be perfect, it was designed to return, over and over, like a tide, like a promise. By August, as the Allies broke out of the hedgerows and poured across France, the truth was undeniable. German tank losses reached 1,800 inches, a single month, a level of attrition the Reich could not sustain. Meanwhile, American armored units received so many new vehicles that some commanders joked they had more tanks than crews. And here, at the height of the breakout, the storylines of El Alamein and Kummersdorf collide into one unavoidable conclusion. The battlefield no longer favored the strongest creation. It favored the system that could replace its losses. As summer bled into fall, that system took full form, not in Normandy's fields, but thousands of miles away, inside American factories roaring day and night. A machine empire awakening. A rhythm of steel, sweat, and sparks. War had been tearing Europe apart for 5 long years, dragging dust over shattered capitals, hauling blades of hunger and fear across entire nations. By late 1943, the world had already lost more than 40 million lives, and the industrial cost was just as staggering. Over 200,000 armored vehicles, 1 million aircraft engines, and rivers of steel smelted, shaped, and sent into battles where machines burned faster than factories could replace them. Germany believed precision would save it. America believed production would. And far from the blood-soaked fields of Normandy, a new battlefield roared to life, one powered not by gunpowder, but by conveyor belts. Detroit, the arsenal of democracy. The name wasn't a slogan, it was a warning, carried on the steam of furnaces and the rhythm of steel presses. Inside the Ford River Rouge plant, sparks rained like comet trails from overhead cranes. Hulls rolled down rails once meant for Model Ts, where families once picked up cars on weekends. The world's most powerful tank line now thundered day and night. America had mobilized 18 million workers for war production, nearly 1/3 of its entire labor force. 2 million of them were women, their welding torches striking arcs of blue-white light across armor plates that would soon cross oceans. Teenage apprentices tightened bolts with hands still learning the world. Skilled engineers retooled entire facilities in weeks. And at the center of it all, the Sherman moved down the line as predictably as the sunrise, one every 56 minutes. Later, by mid-1944, one every 30 minutes. No other nation had ever attempted such a feat, not the British Empire, not the Soviet machine, not the Reich with its obsession for craftsmanship. The United States wasn't merely building tanks, it was building a system that built tanks. That distinction would drag the Axis powers into a race they could never hope to win. Factories across the Midwest pulsed like a beating heart. Cleveland forged engines, Chicago assembled transmissions, Pittsburgh poured steel in tonnage, so massive it could rebuild entire cities. California fitted final drives and shipped them to Europe. Every part of America became a cog in the largest industrial machine in human history. And the numbers were terrifying. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 17,565 Sherman tanks, 22,000 tank destroyers, and more than 96,000 aircraft. Germany, under relentless bombing, dwindling resources, and political delusion, produced a fraction of that. A Tiger tank, their pride and symbol, demanded 300,000 labor hours and teams of specialists. A Sherman asked for speed, standardization, and trust in a process. It was philosophy turned into steel. Every American crate sent to Europe told the same story. Replacement engines pre-assembled and ready. Radios boxed by the thousands, each identical to the last. Suspension units stacked like wooden toys. A mechanic in Normandy could open 3 crates, haul out a gearbox, drop it into a damaged Sherman, and send it back into the fight before dusk. Germany had no answer for that rhythm. Its tanks were masterpieces, but masterpieces were slow. Inside one Chrysler assembly hall, a manager shouted above the noise, "Clock the line!" A whistle blew. Workers paused as another Sherman rolled off the platform under its own power, its engine coughing to life like a promise. Someone scribbled a note on the hull. For the boys in France, it wasn't poetry, it was momentum. Even German intelligence officers could see the storm forming. Reports intercepted in 1944 described American production as mechanized abundance, a phrase loaded with awe and fear. One analyst noted, "The Americans produce as if the machines themselves are alive." Another wrote, "They fight one war while building another." By autumn, this machine empire surged across the Atlantic, filling supply depots in England with row after row of identical tanks. So many that Allied officers joked they could lose an entire battalion and barely notice the gap. And as the factories roared, as the rivers of steel and sweat pushed outward toward Europe, one truth hardened. The outcome of the war would no longer be decided by a single duel, a single tank, or a single battlefield. It would be decided by the industrial tide now rising behind the Sherman. War in 1945 dragged dust over a continent, already carved open by 5 years of fire. More than 60 million lives had been erased. Cities like Cologne, Warsaw, and Hamburg lay in grids of collapsed stone, factory districts smashed into twisted skeletons of rebar and silence. The war had not only devoured nations, it had devoured the idea that brilliance alone could win. And as winter melted into spring, the truth revealed in El Alamein's sand, in Kummersdorf's hangar, in the hedgerows of Normandy, and in the roaring arteries of Detroit finally converged on one place, the dying heart of the Reich. Berlin, April 1945. A city dragging itself toward the final page of history. Its streets cluttered with rubble, its air thick with smoke, its defenders reduced to boys too young to shave and men too old to stand straight. As Soviet artillery hammered the outskirts and Allied bombers carved new wounds into the skyline, one sight pierced the city's exhaustion, a long column of olive-drab silhouettes rolling past the shattered Brandenburg Gate. Sherman tanks, dusty, weather-beaten, some patched with field repairs, some freshly landed from depots, all moving, all alive. It was the ending no German engineer had imagined back in 1942 when they laughed at that first scorched Sherman half buried in the desert. Now the same machine stood inside Berlin itself, fed by belief not in perfection, but in process. Those tanks were the proof of everything the German engineers had tried to deny. That the war had shifted from craftsmanship to capacity, from isolated brilliance to industrial rhythm. A Tiger tank might win a duel, but duels meant nothing when an entire army moved like an assembly line. Inside a dim interrogation center near Augsburg, the final echo of that truth took shape. Heinz Nipkamp, the proud engineer who once shaped the Panther and the Tiger with the devotion of a sculptor, sat across from a young American intelligence officer. Between them, on the table, lay a single Sherman bolt, clean threads gleaming under the lamp. Could Germany have made this? The officer asked quietly. Nipkamp turned the bolt in his hand. He knew the weight of the question. He knew the truth that had dragged across every chapter of this war. "Of course," he said, "we could make one." The officer leaned back, folded his arms, and replied, "We made 1,000,000. The bolt slipped from Nipkamp's fingers and tapped the table, a small metallic sound that carried the collapse of an entire philosophy. He nodded slowly, as if accepting a verdict written 3 years earlier in the sand near El Alamein. "Then you did not just win the war," he said. "You built the world that comes after." That world was already taking shape across the Atlantic. In Washington, months later, at a quiet wartime engineering conference, a slide projector hummed as an American lecturer displayed 2 silhouettes, the Tiger and the Sherman. The audience leaned in, fed by belief in the story they had lived through. "This," the lecturer said, pointing at the Tiger's outline, "was the masterpiece." He spoke of precision, weight, firepower, machines hauling blades of perfection through the battlefield. Then he pointed to the Sherman, and this was the idea. Simple lines, standard parts, interchangeable components, a tank built not to win alone, but to be part of something larger than itself. "We didn't build tanks," he said. "We built a system that could replace them faster than they could be destroyed." Outside Europe, the cost of the war remained staggering. More than 30 million civilians homeless, 70% of Germany's industry crushed, entire rail networks torn apart. Yet from this devastation rose one of the deepest truths the modern world would inherit: that strength is not the absence of weakness, it is the ability to recover faster than you fail. That truth followed the last surviving Sherman to a museum in Bastogne years later, its armor scarred, its paint worn into patches of ghostly white, its tracks frozen in place. Visitors walked around it quietly, studying the plaque that read, "Mass, produced for freedom." Few realized they were not looking at a relic of steel, but a relic of strategy, a reminder that systems, not symbols, shape the future. Because the Tiger, with all its majesty, was the final monument of the artisan age, a machine too perfect for its own survival. The Sherman, with all its imperfections, was the messenger of the industrial one, a machine born from the idea that resilience, not brilliance, wins long wars. And so the war ends where its lesson began, in the hands of ordinary workers, welders, machinists, drivers, and mechanics who built something stronger than a tank, something that could endure, something that could return, something that could scale. If there is a message buried inside the steel of this story, it is this: power is not having the strongest creation. Power is building the system that outlives every loss. And the world we live in today was built by that idea, one bolt, one engine, one tank at a time.